As the street grew darker, Pablo, a young student, put away his tools and headed to the trailer to change. It had been 3 months since he started working at the construction site to help his sick grandmother. She needed very expensive medication. He didn't have a father, and his mother also had to work double shifts. Together, they managed to cover his grandmother's treatment expenses, but they were barely making ends meet. Pablo was very tired because besides work, he was also studying in his 3rd year at university. Now, as he took off his dirty uniform and stood under the hot water with pleasure, he mentally anticipated a pleasant evening with his classmates. They were planning to watch football at one of the sports cafes in the city center. However, as soon as Pablo got dressed, he received a message from his mom. "Grandma is really bad. I'm afraid it's the end. Come as soon as possible," she wrote, ending with a sad emoji. Concerned, Pablo immediately called a taxi and gave the hospital address to the driver. He didn't like coming here. The sharp smells, the sad, tear-streaked, or frightened faces, the constantly rushing doctors and staff, the cold lighting. Until the last moment, the young man hoped that his grandmother, his warm and cozy granny whom he adored, would soon be discharged from this bleak place. However, his mother's message dispelled his illusions. Pablo sighed and called the elevator to go up to the 4th floor. Perhaps he could find his grandmother's room in pitch darkness. He had visited her so many times. And now, it seems, he's doing it for the last time. His heart squeezed, a traitorous lump rose in his throat, and he desperately wanted to cry. He clenched his teeth because he knew that tears wouldn't help his grandmother. He had to be strong and manage to tell the most beloved person how much he loved her and how much he would miss her. Pablo entered the room without knocking, trying not to make any unnecessary noise. All the nurses and doctors had long been used to him and didn't pay attention anymore. However, there was no one else in the room except for his mom and grandmother. At the sight of the latter, a pang pierced the young man's heart again. During her illness, his grandmother had become extremely thin, almost weightless. Pablo didn't know how she was still holding on. His grandmother's eyelids were closed, she was sound asleep. Her face was peaceful, no hints of pain or suffering. And yet, there was such fragility in her entire appearance that Pablo was afraid that at some point she would simply melt away into the air. Again, with an effort of will, the young man suppressed his tears and approached the bed. "How is she?" Pablo whispered. His mom, holding his grandmother's hand, was pale and sorrowful. "She's very weak," she whispered back. Her hair was disheveled, her shoulders slumped, as if the woman bore the weight of the world on them. Pablo embraced his mother. "You need to rest, Mom," he whispered softly. But the woman just shook her head. "I can't leave right now. The doctor said Grandma probably won't make it through the night." With these words, Pablo's mother silently began to cry. There was nothing left for the young man to do but hold her tightly. When the woman calmed down a bit, he suggested they walk to the cafeteria. "Are you sure? I'm afraid to leave her even for a minute." Pablo confidently looked his mother in the eyes. "Don't worry, I'll be right here. Go have something hot to drink and a snack." His mother shook her head. "I couldn't swallow anything right now. You need to take care of yourself, Mom. I don't want you ending up in the hospital too," Pablo reasoned. His mother nodded thankfully. "You're right, son. I'll try to eat something." With these words, his mother left the room. Pablo sighed and looked at his sleeping grandmother again. Random childhood memories started flooding his mind. There's Grandma taking him to the amusement park where he first tasted mint ice cream and a crunchy waffle cone, and there she is giving him a fluffy white rabbit for his birthday. How happy he was that day! Pablo became so deeply engrossed in his memories that he didn't immediately hear his grandmother's soft sigh. He only snapped out of it when she let out a weak groan and opened her eyes. Pablo gently took his grandmother's hand and smiled warmly at her. "Abuela, how are you?" But his grandmother didn't respond to him. She looked at him as if she couldn't understand who was in front of her. "Is that you, Felipe?" she whispered. Have you come for me? Pablo was slightly taken aback. He didn't know who Felipe was. His grandfather's name was also Pablo. Abuela, it's me, your grandson. For a few moments, his grandmother looked at him with a lack of understanding. Ah, it's you, Pablito, she whispered. Pablo felt a hint of disappointment in her words. Or was it just his imagination? Pablo looked closely at his grandmother. Her gaze was distant, as if she were mentally somewhere very far away. And who is Felipe? The young man dared to ask. His grandmother weakly smiled and closed her eyes. Her face took on a dreamy expression. Felipe. He was my first love, the old woman answered softly. Pablo was incredibly surprised. He never thought his grandmother loved anyone other than his grandfather. He even felt a little sorry that he asked. Good thing Mom didn't hear, he thought. Or did she know about it? Women are more interested in such matters. Perhaps his grandmother had already told his mother about her life before marriage. Pablo was pulled from his thoughts by a dry cough from his grandmother. The old woman paled considerably and took a long time to recover. Again this cough, complained the grandmother. I'm so tired of these fits. It was different when I was young. Pablo stroked his grandmother's hand. Where were you living back then, Abuela? He asked. Oh, I traveled a lot around the country. I worked in various places. I had a good education, you see. I was hired as a governess in wealthy households, and I raised the children of merchants and even aristocrats. How many girls I turned into ladies. The grandmother said all this slowly and very quietly, but she kept smiling. How pleasant it is for old people to remember their youth. They always look back. It's because they have nothing ahead of them. Pablo thought sadly. The dreamy expression on the grandmother's face suddenly turned troubled. Pablito. I know that soon. The grandmother began, but before she could finish her sentence, she was again overcome by a prolonged fit of coughing. Throughout this time, the young man held her hand. Finally, the coughing fit subsided. It's better not to waste your strength on words, Abuela, Pablo advised. But the grandmother stubbornly shook her head. Don't interfere, Pablito, I know better, she said. It was clear that the words were difficult for her, but the old woman had no intention of giving up. She had always been a warrior, flashed through Pablo's mind. As much as he knew his grandmother, she never despaired until the very end and always persevered towards her goals. I know I'll die soon, continued the grandmother. The doctors have nothing to do with it. I can feel it. Pablo wanted to object, but the grandmother gestured for him to be silent. Listen, Pablito. Before I die, there's something important I must tell you. It's very important. The grandmother's expression was very serious at these words. Pablo remained surprised and silent. Suddenly, the doors of the room opened, and a nurse entered. The grandmother looked at her from under her brows. Are you awake? The girl said friendly. Do you need anything? The grandmother shook her head. Her whole demeanor spoke only one thing. She wanted the nurse to leave as soon as possible. Sensing this, the girl removed the empty medicine bottles from the table and left the room. The grandmother took a deep breath, gathering her strength to continue. However, the cursed cough made her fall silent again for a long time. When the fit subsided, Pablo noted with pity that his grandma had become even paler. Pablito, she whispered. Yes, Abuela, Pablo replied, leaning a little closer. For some reason, he suddenly felt that after this, his life would never be the same. In my red notebook, which is in the nightstand, you'll find the address of a lawyer, the grandmother said. When I die, go to him. He will show you your home. Pablo couldn't believe his ears. Has Grandma lost her mind? He thought. Abuela, what are you talking about? He asked aloud. You'll learn everything from the letter the lawyer will give you, Pablito, the grandmother replied weakly. Her gaze, which had been wandering along the walls for a long time, finally settled on her grandson. You've grown up so much, Pablito, the grandmother said admiringly. Then she leaned back on the pillows and closed her eyes. I feel so weak, she barely whispered. I want to sleep a little. Pablo nodded without saying a word. He pictured his grandmother as a very young girl. What was she like back then? He knew she had lost her parents early and had to stand on her own feet. She had always been very strong, his fragile grandmother. His mother quietly entered the room. Is she still asleep? She whispered. She woke up briefly, Pablo replied softly. She coughed a lot. And she said, I have a home. What? What home? His mother's eyes widened in surprise. Maybe she imagined something? Pablo shrugged. Who knows what happens to one's mind in old age? Mother agreed with him. That night, grandmother passed away. She didn't wake up again and quietly died in her sleep. When Pablo was collecting his grandmother's belongings from the nightstand, he came across a red notebook and absent-mindedly tucked it into his shirt pocket. The whole day passed in hustle and bustle. Pablo and his mother didn't have a single peaceful moment. The young man was even grateful for this. It made him worry less about the loss. In the evening, when he returned to the dormitory and lay down on the bed without undressing, he felt something solid in his pocket and remembered the notebook. He pulled out the worn-out booklet and started flipping through the pages. They were filled with fragments of thoughts and lines. Sometimes grandmother wrote poems, as well as recipes and shopping lists. With tears in his eyes, Pablo looked at the familiar handwriting of his grandmother from childhood, running his finger over the neat letters. As he was about to close the notebook, the young man suddenly noticed an address and a signature underneath it on the last page, Lawyer Ismael Torres. Pablo remembered his grandmother's last words, when I die, go to him. He will show you your home. Could this be true? Pablo couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about his grandmother's mysterious words. The next day he woke up very early, despite sleeping poorly. First thing, Pablo went to the construction site and announced that he was quitting. Then the young man went to the train station and bought a ticket. Taking some water and sandwiches, he entered the train carriage and sat by the window. He had to travel all day. Pablo looked out the window and tried to guess what awaited him. He arrived in an unfamiliar seaside town closer to nightfall. Taking a taxi, the young man reached one of the hotels in the center and stayed there overnight. The next day, Pablo had breakfast at a cafe and went to the address he found in the red notebook. Finding the right house, he immediately saw a sign that read Legal Services. Pablo approached the door and rang the old-fashioned silver bell. The door opened, and he entered, finding himself in a cozy hallway in front of the reception desk. How can I help you? Asked a charming girl, adjusting a light strand of hair that had fallen out of place. Sophia, her badge read. Pablo was slightly taken aback. He really liked the girl. Then he gathered his thoughts and said, I need to speak to a lawyer named Ismael Torres. Can I do that now? Sophia glanced at the computer monitor, typed something on the keyboard. He's currently with a client, but you can meet with Mr. Torres in about 15 minutes. Would you mind waiting a bit? She replied, once again raising her blue eyes to him. Pablo melted completely and, silently nodding, sat down on the bright leather couch. Maybe I should ask her for her phone number? Pablo thought to himself. Then he shook his head mentally. First things first, he needed to get the business done, then he could think about dates. Besides, this girl lives almost on the other side of the country. What was he even thinking? Finally, the time came, and Sophia escorted him to the lawyer's office. Pablo thanked the girl, and for a moment he thought she blushed a little. Then he dismissed these thoughts and knocked on the door. Come in, came the invitation from behind the door. Pablo opened the door and found himself in a spacious office. Behind a large desk made of light wood sat a gray-haired old man. He looked at least 80, but the clear gaze of his eyes and the confidence with which he stood up to greet the client revealed strength and energy in him. Probably all thanks to the sea air. Everyone here looks quite good, Pablo decided to himself. He shook the dry yet firm hand of the lawyer and took the offered seat. What should I call you? asked Ismael Torres, and Pablo stated his first and last name. It matched his grandmother's. The lawyer didn't raise an eyebrow. Pablo became anxious. If his grandmother had told the truth, he surely would have remembered her rare last name. But then Pablo thought, perhaps when his grandmother dealt with Torres, she still used her maiden name. Gathering his courage, Pablo began his story. He told the lawyer about his grandmother, her illness, and her last words to him before she passed away. Then he showed Ismael the entry in the red notebook and mentioned her name. Torres carefully examined his own address for a moment, then remained silent for a while. What do you make of this?" Pablo asked nervously, eager to know if his journey had been worthwhile. Torres cleared his throat lightly. "I remember your grandmother very well. She was a wonderful woman. So, she's gone." It seemed to Pablo that the lawyer discreetly wiped away a tear. "So, was my grandmother telling the truth? About some house that belongs to me?" he asked. The lawyer looked attentively at the young man and nodded briefly. "Before we proceed, I would like to carefully review your documents." "Of course," Pablo nodded hastily. He took out a folder and handed it to Torres. The lawyer silently examined the documents for a while. Then Ismael Torres got up and walked to the large desk where the archives were kept. He stood there for a moment, as if contemplating where to look, then pulled out one of the drawers and started going through the folders inside. Finally, he pulled one out, pushed the drawer shut, and returned to the table where Pablo was sitting. "Here," Ismael Torres said, gently placing the folder on the table. "This document has been kept here for over 30 years. What does it say?" Pablo asked, barely breathing. "It's Felipe Treviso's will." Pablo felt dizzy. He remembered how his grandmother called him Felipe when she regained consciousness for the last time. 30 years ago, Felipe left his house to your grandmother in his will. However, she didn't want to live in it. Now that she's gone, it belongs to you. Pablo felt everything spinning before his eyes. So, his grandmother's words weren't the ramblings of a sick old woman. Pablo still couldn't believe it. And then a simple thought occurred to him. Wait. But if my grandmother died, shouldn't the house go to my mother? But Ismael Torres shook his head. The thing is, Felipe wrote in his will that in the event of Veronica's, your grandmother's, death, the house should pass to his male heir. He thought your grandmother had given birth to a son. So now, the rightful owner of the house was him. Pablo's breath caught again. It wasn't easy to adjust to the idea that a house had suddenly fallen into his lap. Seeing his bewilderment, Ismael Torres opened the will folder again and took out a yellowed envelope. Before we proceed with the paperwork, read this letter. It was written to you by your grandmother. Pablo took the envelope with trembling hands. The lawyer stood up from the table and, apologizing, said he would step out for a moment to grab a coffee. The young man understood that he was simply tactfully leaving him alone with himself and mentally thanked the old man. When Torres left, Pablo opened the envelope and pulled out several folded, yellowed sheets of paper. He unfolded it and began to read. Dear Pablito, it's me, Veronica, your grandmother. I'm sorry I never told you this story while I was alive. But now the time has come, and I hope you're ready to hear it. When I was 22 years old, I got a job as a governess in one of the wealthiest mansions on the coast. The house stood on the slope of a mountain, and almost every window had a view of the sea. I couldn't be happier. You know how much I love the sea. Moreover, there was a huge old garden in the house, where large walnut trees grew, fuchsias and orchids bloomed. I was enchanted by both the garden and the house, and my cozy room on the ground floor, where the most wonderful scents from the garden wafted in. My pupil was little Marisol, a wonderful 8-year-old girl. We studied French and Italian, conducted experiments, collected petals and leaves to dry them between the pages of books. We ran to swim at the wild beach, collected seashells, and built forts out of pebbles. We sewed dresses and staged plays. Marisol loved playing the piano, and we would make music together for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Our life was full of little discoveries and great happiness. Marisol's family treated me with great respect and kindness, and I began to feel like I always belonged in that place. Sometimes before falling asleep, I imagined myself as Marisol's older sister. It calmed me so much that I slept the most peaceful sleep. The only thing that occasionally bothered me were the strange sensations I sometimes felt in the garden. It seemed to me that someone was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anyone. Only once did I notice a slight fluttering of tulle at the window on the third floor. However, I knew that floor was uninhabited. Marisol's parents and the girl herself lived on the second floor. So I decided it was just the wind. However, very soon I learned that I was mistaken. It was a typical noon. Marisol and I were running around the garden, playing tag. Then the girl suggested playing hide and seek. She said she would hide, and I had to find her. I agreed and, closing my eyes, counted to 100. Then I went in search of the girl. I knew she liked to hide in a large hollow in one of the trees, so I didn't hurry too much so that the game wouldn't end too quickly. I walked along the path that circled the house, pretending to look for Marisol, when suddenly I noticed something strange. A white envelope was descending on a thin string from above. I looked up but saw no one. The envelope was right next to me, and I took it in my hands. The string fell nearby. I began to examine the envelope and was surprised to see my name on it. Señorita Veronica, read the neat letters. I lifted my head again, trying to understand where this mysterious message came from, but once again noticed nothing unusual. All the windows were closed. I reread the inscription and, remembering that Marisol was waiting for me to find her, folded the envelope and tucked it into the pocket of my dress. We played in the garden for a while longer, then we were called in for lunch. After lunch, Marisol usually rested in the nursery, leaving me with some free time. I retreated to my room, threw myself onto the bed, and pulled out the envelope. Burning with impatience, I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of pristine white paper with a beautiful golden pattern along the edge. I unfolded it. The sheet was written in the same beautiful handwriting as my name. I began to read. Here's what the letter said. Dear Veronica, it's been 3 months since you appeared in this house, and every day it has become a little brighter because of you. You seem to have lit the sun in the sky. That's how I feel your presence in my life. You are the most beautiful flower I've ever seen in our garden. You are charming and unique. Forgive my recklessness, but I could no longer contain my impulse and decided to write to you. You have no idea of my existence, nor do you need to know who I am. I just want you to realize what a miracle you create for me every day. I wish for you to remain as happy and serene as you are and to bring joy to everyone around you. After finishing reading, I sat motionless for a while, trying to make sense of what had been revealed to me. There is someone else living in this house whom I had no idea about. And they are watching me. Yes, they've been watching me from the very first day. And I had no clue. I felt awkward and strange at the thought. Who is this mysterious stranger? Suddenly, I felt like the heroine of a 19th century novel. Can such things happen in real life? I desperately wanted to find out who the author of the mysterious letter was, no matter what. Doing so turned out to be difficult. When I showed the letter to Marisol, she just shrugged and shook her head. I've never seen this handwriting before. Mom and Dad write differently. Of course, I didn't dare ask the homeowners about it. Something intuitively held me back. I was terribly afraid of losing my job and my newfound magical life alongside Marisol. After some thought, I asked one of the maids, the modest girl Mia, if anyone else lived in the house besides the homeowner's family and the servants. She looked at me with alarm and immediately averted her gaze. It seems she knows something but won't say, I realized. That's when I decided to keep an eye on the maids and find out everything. The next day, shortly before lunch, I went into the kitchen and announced that I wouldn't be eating because my stomach was upset. I went to my room and slammed the door loudly so that everyone could hear me inside. Then I quietly slipped into the corridor and, silently closing the door behind me, crept to the stairs. I deliberately took off my shoes to avoid making noise and quickly climbed to the third floor, finding myself on a small landing, on one side of which was a heavy, massive door, and on the other, a window. I approached the door and tried the handle. It was locked. Then I went to the window and hid behind the heavy curtain, giving myself the opportunity to cautiously peek out from behind it. I didn't have to wait long. About 15 minutes later, heavy footsteps could be heard on the stairs. It could only be Martha, a middle-aged woman who worked in the kitchen. I peeked very carefully from my hiding place. Just as expected, Martha was holding a silver tray with plates of lunch, a glass of juice, and utensils. Martha placed the tray on the table near the door and pulled out a golden key from her apron. Suddenly, my nose started itching unbearably. Apparently, some dust got into it. I hid behind the curtain and, unable to resist, sneezed, trying to do it quietly. I heard Martha start turning the key in the door but then stop. Apparently, she had heard some noise. I held my breath. I really didn't want Martha to discover me. However, the woman seemed to think she had imagined it. I heard the door creak. I cautiously peeked out from behind the curtain again, but the door had already closed, hiding Martha and the tray from me. Deciding not to tempt fate any longer, I quietly slipped out from behind the curtain and dashed downstairs. Finding myself in my room, I caught my breath, feeling safe. Despite learning very little, I felt like a victor. Now I knew the third floor was inhabited, and that's where the mysterious stranger who wrote me the letter lived. My imagination was already painting romantic pictures, inventing 100 scenarios, what he looked like and why he stayed locked away like a true recluse. In the end, I decided to write a reply. Here's what I came up with. Dear stranger, thank you for all the compliments you bestowed upon me. I'm very flattered. I would like to know more about you. What is your name? And why do you never leave your room? When everyone had gone to sleep, I went back up to the third floor. I sealed the letter in an envelope and now slid it into the gap between the heavy locked door and the floor. Satisfied with my deed, I returned to my room, where only then did a troubling thought occur to me. What if someone among the servants finds my message? I didn't leave a signature. Would they guess that I wrote the letter? Or would they immediately give it to the mistress, who had seen my handwriting many times in Marisol's notebooks? Why hadn't I written the letter in printed letters? In the end, I couldn't sleep all night, and the next day I was pale and tired. However, my worries turned out to be in vain. When Marisol and I were walking in the garden, and the girl was running between the trees in search of squirrels, a letter fell into my hands again. I instantly looked up and managed to catch a glimpse of a hand quickly closing the window shutter. As before, I hid the letter in the pocket of my dress, and Marisol and I played in the garden until lunchtime. When I found myself back in my room, I immediately pulled out the envelope and, impatiently tearing it open, began to read eagerly. Dear Veronica, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Felipe, and I live on the third floor, as you may have already guessed. I don't leave my room because I can't walk after an illness I had as a teenager. As I read these words, tears welled up in my eyes. I decided to become a recluse because I couldn't accept the change that happened to me. I still remember the feeling of grass under my bare feet, the smooth pebbles of the beach, and the gentle warm waves of the sea. Unfortunately, I lost all of that and now live my life reading books and studying sciences. Besides, I love calligraphy and watercolor. Felipe's letter went on to describe his secluded life for a while longer. I felt sorry for him. I took a sheet of paper and wrote just one sentence, "Can I see you?" Then I did the same as the first time. I went up to the third floor and slid the note under the door. The next day in the garden, I received a response. There was only one line in the note, "Yes, today after lunch." I was very excited and became terribly distracted. After hastily eating lunch and wishing Marisol a good nap, I went to my room. Felipe had chosen this time wisely. After lunch, everyone in the house had a short break, and the risk of someone noticing me going up to the third floor was minimal. I stood in front of the mirror and critically examined myself. After some thought, I changed into my favorite blue dress, the one I wore for outings, and gathered my hair at the nape of my neck, leaving a few wavy strands to frame my face. Satisfied, I opened the door and quietly left the room. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest. I even began to fear that someone would hear it. After taking a few deep breaths, I calmed down a bit and started climbing the stairs. At the door on the 3rd floor, I hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly. After a few moments, I heard the key turn in the lock. Apparently, my stranger was already waiting for me. My heart was ready to leap out of my chest with fear. Finally, the door opened, and I saw Felipe for the first time. He was sitting in a wheelchair and was quite handsome, dark curly hair and kind brown eyes, broad shoulders and long slender fingers, indicating an artistic soul. He looked about 25. He looked at me for a while, then bowed his head in a slight respectful nod. I was completely embarrassed. Felipe moved aside, clearing the way for me, and I entered his domain. The entire 3rd floor belonged to him alone. There were several rooms where he pursued art, painting, playing the piano, crafting things from wood, molding clay. There was also a small kitchen and a library with many books. This place seemed to me like a secret world known to very few, Felipe's parents and a few loyal servants. Even little Marisol didn't know she had a brother. It was astonishing and very sad. Felipe treated me to tea and pastries, and we talked for a long time about literature and art. He was an incomparable conversationalist. He knew a lot and could talk about any topic. 2 hours flew by unnoticed. I was so intrigued by Felipe. When I accidentally glanced at the clock, I couldn't believe my eyes. Gasping, I jumped up, saying it was time for me to go to Marisol. He nodded, looking at me with a long, sad gaze, and asked if I would come again. I replied that I would. As I hurried down the stairs, I realized that I was already looking forward to the next meeting with Felipe. We started secretly meeting every day, and I got to know this mysterious recluse more and more. He turned out to be wonderful, kind, noble, attentive, and sensitive. Felipe had an excellent sense of humor, and it was easy and pleasant to be with him. It hadn't been much time, but I couldn't imagine my life without him anymore. At some point, I realized I loved Felipe and felt he loved me with all his heart. But could our relationship have a future? I dreaded the thought of Felipe's parents finding out about our meetings, and I would be immediately dismissed. This thought caused me wild pain. Now I understood that I would lose more than just a job, the opportunity to live in the dream house by the sea, and spend time in Marisol's pleasant company. Most of all, I was afraid of losing Felipe, my love. He immediately sensed my state. Approaching me, my beloved took my hand and looked into my eyes. "What troubles you, darling?" he asked. Tears welled up in my eyes. "I'm so afraid of losing you, Felipe," I confessed. "Where does this fear come from?" he wondered, running his hand through my hair. I felt the touch of his soft fingers throughout my body, which gave me peace and confidence. "Just, if your parents find out, I'll be fired immediately. I'm sure they won't like that we're secretly seeing each other. I'm just a governess and should know my place." Felipe lightly touched my lips, as if asking me to be quiet for a moment. "Veronica, even if our parents find out everything, it won't change anything. I'm already an adult and can decide for myself what to do. And I love you, darling. And I choose to be with you. No one can stop us." I smiled at him, although tears clouded my eyes. I wanted to believe Felipe's words with all my heart, but a bad feeling crept inside me, poisoning everything. It seemed to me that we had no time left. And it happened just like that. Once, when I came to Felipe, he said he wanted me to become his wife. I was very happy to hear this, but doubts tore at my soul. "We cannot marry in secret," I told Felipe. "We need to tell your parents everything." He nodded briefly. "I'll do it first thing tomorrow morning. They will know everything." When I heard those words, fear shook me inside. But seeing the determination in Felipe's face, I didn't say anything. I stayed with him until late in the evening that day. Marisol wasn't home. She had gone yachting with her parents. We talked a lot, held hands, and Felipe kissed me for the first time. It was so beautiful that I couldn't help but cry again. He stroked my hair, whispered sweet words to me, and said that everything would be okay. I didn't want to leave him that night. Something told my heart that we might not see each other again. But I tried to push those thoughts away. Felipe looked very happy, and I didn't want to cloud his mood with my worries. When it was already very dark, I wanted to say goodbye to Felipe, but he didn't let go of my hand at the door for a long time. "Do you want to stay with me tonight?" he asked very quietly. I hesitantly looked at him, but in his eyes shone such strong love that doubts immediately left me. I turned to him and, leaning in, kissed his lips. I was with Felipe until dawn, and we didn't close our eyes for a moment. His gentle touches stayed in my memory forever. When dawn broke, I kissed him for the last time and said it was time for me to return to my room. He escorted me to the door. At the threshold, I turned around and looked at my beloved once more. He was also looking into my eyes, and I felt that invisible threads had forever connected us. When I returned to my room, I couldn't sleep. I was too nervous. I knew that soon there would be a conversation between Felipe and his parents, and I was eagerly awaiting it. However, after some time, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I was awakened by a loud knock on the door. "Pack your things and get out of our house." I heard the landlady shout. "You're fired." At first, I thought it was just a terrible dream, but all of this was happening in reality. I got up, staggering, and started packing my modest dresses and books. It took me no more than half an hour to pack my suitcase. There was another knock on the door. "Are you ready?" I heard the landlady's impatient voice. "We won't wait forever. Senor Travieso is already in the car. He'll take you to the city." I took my suitcase and opened the door. The landlady looked at me with disgust. "Bold, promiscuous girl," she thought of me. "Thought you could live off our money," the woman said coldly, confirming my thoughts. "It won't work, street urchin. And you pretended to be so well-mannered." "I hope you won't tell Marisol," I pleaded. The woman gave me an angry look. "Don't you dare even mention her name with your filthy mouth," she almost shrieked. Blushing, I cast my eyes down. We didn't speak anymore. I silently walked to the exit of the house and sat in the back seat of the landlord's car. He didn't say a word to me either, just drove me to the city and dropped me off at the station. I stood in the middle of the square, pale, bewildered, lonely. I managed to find a decent room in the city center, which I rented for a few days. I was sure that Felipe would come to the city and look for me, so every day I went out and walked around the center near the station. I thought it would make it easier for him to find me. But each time I returned home alone, I never met Felipe. I was desperate, not knowing what to do or how to proceed. The days blurred together like raindrops. I missed Felipe terribly, Marisol, and the home that seemed so beautiful to me. And then I found out that I was pregnant, and I would have a child. Felipe's child. I cried for a long time, not knowing what to do. My savings were rapidly dwindling. I didn't know how to break the news to Felipe that he would soon be a father. Finally, I decided to write him a letter. For some reason, I was sure we would have a boy. I told Felipe everything on paper and at the end wrote my address with a request to come as soon as possible. I didn't know how to prevent his relatives or servants from intercepting the letter. I couldn't trust anyone. Then I remembered Marisol. Only she could help me. And I set off, giving the driver almost the last money I had. He brought me home, where I had spent so many wonderful days. Of course, I didn't ring the gate. Trying to remain unnoticed, I walked along the tall ivy-covered fence surrounding the garden. Suddenly I heard Marisol singing and, peering through the gap between the leaves, I saw the girl. She was sitting on the grass not far from where I stood. "Marisol," I called, not very loudly. I didn't want anyone else besides the child to hear me. Surely Marisol now had a new governess, and she could be nearby. The girl turned around, surprised. Marisol, I repeated a little quieter. Who's calling me? The girl asked, frightened. It's me, Veronica. I'm behind the hedge, I replied, afraid that the girl wouldn't want to talk to me or, worse, would call an adult. Marisol jumped to her feet and ran to the hedge. Veronica! Where are you? I miss you so much. Why did you leave me? She quickly and slightly offendedly chattered. I reached out to her. I'm here, Marisol. Forgive me, but I couldn't do anything. Your parents thought I wasn't suitable for the role of your governess. Marisol burst into tears. But why? Let me talk to them. My new governess is awful. It's so boring with her. You'll have to learn to love her, my dear. There's nothing we can do here. I'm sorry, I tried to comfort the girl. Marisol squeezed my hand and cried. It seemed to me that someone was coming down the path. Listen, sweetheart, I quickly said. Can you help me? The girl released my hand and wiped her tears with her fists. Of course, she nodded. Just tell me how. I slipped a white envelope between the bars of the fence. Please, take this envelope to the 3rd floor and slide it into the slot under the heavy locked door, I said. The girl took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. But why? She asked, surprised. It's a secret for now, I whispered back. I'll tell you next time. Just let it remain our secret, all right? Make sure no one knows about the envelope. The girl nodded, smiling cunningly. I'll do as you say. But when will we see each other again? My heart tightened. I knew this was likely our last meeting. But I decided a lie would be better than the truth for now. Soon, I said. Promise? I just nodded, barely holding back tears. Marisol. Where are you, my dear? I heard an unfamiliar deep voice. The girl flinched, hastily hiding the envelope in her bosom. It's Senorita Perez, she's looking for me, she quickly said. I must go. Goodbye, Veronica. I stood by the fence for a long time, silently crying. Goodbye, my girl, goodbye, I whispered before leaving. I returned to the city, and the next day I developed a fever. With no money left, I was on the brink of despair. Deciding to ask my neighbor for some fever medicine, I somehow made it to her door, and when she opened it, I felt like I was about to faint. The neighbor turned out to be a kindly elderly woman with a big heart. Seeing my condition, she took me in, sat me on the couch in her living room, and called the doctor. The doctor turned out to be a young man named Pablo. Yes, Pablito, that was your grandfather. It seemed he fell for me at first sight. He prescribed me medicines, and when he found out I had no money to buy them, he went to the pharmacy himself. He visited me every day, brought flowers, fruits, and sweets, monitored my health, and cheered me up with kind words. When I recovered, he often brought groceries and invited me to various places, concerts, theaters, or just for a walk. I sincerely thanked him for his help but refused to go anywhere. However, he was persistent. So, I told him what had happened to me. Learning that I would soon have a child, he turned pale and, apologizing, left. I thought he wouldn't come back. I waited for Felipe, but he didn't come. I don't know why. Maybe Marisol didn't manage to discreetly give him the letter. Or maybe his parents forbade him from leaving the house. A week later, Pablo came to me again. In his hands, he held a large bouquet of roses. He knelt down and proposed to me. He said he was ready to accept my child as his own and vowed to take care of me for the rest of his life. I cried, not knowing what to do. I loved Felipe so much, but he never came. And both the child and I needed protection. I saw what a good and noble person Dr. Pablo was, and feeling immense gratitude towards him, I agreed to marry him. However, Felipe remained the only one in my heart. Dear Pablito, now you know the story of my first love, and I hope you won't judge me. Pablo finished reading and sat still for a while. Then he stood up and walked to the window, where swallows were flying. He didn't hear Ismael Torres return to the office. "I see you've already read the letter," he said quietly. Pablo turned away from the window and nodded. "Felipe Treviso died when your mother was 12 years old. His parents died in a car accident 5 years before that. Marisol was married and gone from home by then. Felipe left the house to your grandmother in his will. We struggled to find her address and sent her a letter. She came here. It was our only meeting, but honestly, your grandmother is hard to forget. She had a special charm and fragility. Did she refuse the inheritance? She said she couldn't live in the house where everything reminded her of Felipe. She didn't want to sell it either. So all this time, the house was waiting for you." Pablo nodded and shook the lawyer's hand. "I thank you for everything you've done for me. Now I know a little more about my grandmother's life, and it means a lot to me. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss the details related to the house? Today, I'd like to be alone for a while." Ismael Torres nodded and escorted Pablo to the door. The young man said goodbye to Sofia, left the building, and walked to the sea. He wandered along the shore for a long time, listening to the cries of seagulls and the rustle of pebbles under his feet. "Abuela, my dear," he murmured. "You kept the secret of your first love for so long, but I thank you for finally deciding to share it with me." Pablo noticed a pink and white heart-shaped pebble at his feet. He picked it up and threw it into the sea. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.
Alright, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick? Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my 2nd year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked. We could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. "I will do my best." Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. "Did you not hear what I said?" "I'm sorry." I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, "I'm thirsty." Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. "I don't care what they say, I plan to quit any time," he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. "To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance." As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. "Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them." It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. "Still here?" Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick? What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was. As the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their inn. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here." "He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.